Good afternoon, everyone. Making a video real quick about what's going on the battlefield. Wasn't going to make one actually, but a lot has taken place in the last 24 hours, so I felt the need to do so. I'm going to talk about two areas real quick. Obviously Lyman, which is where we've seen the greatest advances recently, but also a lot taking place down in this region near Kherson. So something to think about. This area right here was originally the feint area. So when Ukraine originally started this counteroffensive season, quote unquote, they feinted down to Kherson. They had a major media campaign saying they were going to move into this area, and obviously because of that, the Russians reinforced heavily here. Well, it turned out to be a very good feint, because in fact the Ukrainians hit up in here near Kharkiv and drove the Russians completely out of this region up in here. And this is where we're at right now. Well, the reality is yes, this down here was a feint, but it also was a real operation, were it to be able to. Now, how this is working is the Ukrainians have a greater ability to maneuver within the battle space. They can maneuver back and forth between battlefields. They can move logistics in. They have the capability to funnel things here and then spread them between the two major fronts. Unfortunately for the Russians, but fortunately for all those of us that want Ukraine to win, Russia can't do that. They have to go completely, they're completely lateral. They can only operate laterally in an arc, because if they need to reinforce down here, they have to either land troops or bring them through Crimea, or they have to bring them from over here. They don't have a centralized location to distribute. So this is causing problems for the Russians, as the Russians fell for the feint, reinforced heavily here, lost a ton of territory over near Lyman, and so they were like, ah, crap, started funneling troops over here to try and at least help the withdrawal. This opened up the entirety of the Kherson region to Ukraine. Ukraine held back and now has launched into this region. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Now, talking about this region right here, this is significant as this is largely flat ground. There's not a lot of terrain features that are going to hold up a ground force from driving Russia out of here. Russia loses the advantage of terrain here, so you could potentially see this devolve somewhat rapidly, if that's what their aim is right now, the Ukrainians' aim. So moving on to a close-up of that area, the Lyman region, you see two things that happen. So a few days ago, this was all red. Now it's blue. That means Ukraine took it back. But what we're starting to see is forks come out, and what likely is happening is Russians are abandoning, and you have one fork trying to push towards Rubizhne and one fork trying to push towards Lysychansk. There's currently operations taking place up in here that are blocking efforts, and actually to the south as well. And I think what they're trying to do is set conditions with recon elements here to try and see if they can once again conduct an envelopment and retake Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. They actually have the upper hand in such a manner that they could just conduct blocking efforts and then drive hard with their main effort force through and take these critical cities. These are critical for any kind of Russian movements, but we're already hearing that Russians are falling back and retreating out of this very quickly. So I don't know what the time frame is, but I suspect in the next few weeks to month or so, and I've said weeks to month and it's happened in days, we could see a lot of this terrain in here turn blue. Up here they're conducting operations as well. I think they're trying to get whatever this Svatov, I think is what it is. They're trying to look at potentially moving in there as well, trying to basically cut off any logistics routes into this region for Russia. So that's kind of where Lyman stands. Now, moving to what the big news is today is down in Kherson. So what we're seeing down in Kherson is the after effects of Russia departing the area to try and conduct reinforcements. They've also departed somewhat, and they've fallen back to new lines. These are all estimated lines, obviously, but falling back to new lines, allowing the Ukrainians to move forward. But Ukraine is doing it in a way that I don't think the Russians expected, and that is they're creating a hammer and anvil. So there's an anvil effort here, and it probably actually even goes all the way to here. The Ukrainians are creating feint operations that are actually gaining territory in this region, and then just in the last 24 to 48 hours they've started taking large swaths of territory in here, and they are sweeping downward through this area here, and they're going to try and just flush every Russian troop towards the anvil, and when it gets close enough, the anvil will come crushing down on top of Russian troops, and they will take this entire region right next to the Dnipro River. This is the Dnipro River as it runs right through here, and we may see this whole area turn blue at some point. Now, I don't know the time frame, but just from movements on the battlefield, that's what it looks like. It looks like we're going to see Ukrainians, their main effort forces sweeping through here, and an anvil blocking force stopping here, and then crashing down on the Russians when this force comes in. And it's just going to be sweeping efforts, and then later on, liberating Kherson in its entirety will be the next effort. So because of all of this, I'm officially changing my stance on how the U.S. and the West should be assisting Ukraine at this point. I think it's time that we give Ukraine the means to fully eject Russia out of this country right now. There's a small window of opportunity here where Russia is knocked back on their heels very heavily, and I think we can give them Abrams tanks, give the Ukrainians Abrams tanks, give them Reaper drones, which have a greater range of analysis and detection, give them the ATACMS. So with the ATACMS, they can, let me go back to the main, they can hit everything in these regions and destroy, even Crimea, and destroy Russian targets. Give them NASAMS, which NASAMS are an intermediate or a short to medium range anti-aircraft missile system. We said we were going to give them to them, and we were supposed to, we just haven't. So it's a more effective anti-air system in case Russia becomes a little more desperate and starts wanting to use its air force in this region. Now, the obvious question that a lot of people are going to ask is nuclear weapons. Does Russia become desperate? And the thing about nuclear weapons, and I saw this in a talk on YouTube between some very intelligent gentlemen talking about how a tactical nuclear weapon creates a big boom in a small place. They would need to use hundreds across this battle space for it to be effective. So I just don't think Putin is really in that place to start doing something like that. And according to both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, they have been in contact with high-level people in the Kremlin saying there will be catastrophic responses from the United States and NATO if nuclear weapons are used. That term catastrophic is not used lightly when it comes to the United States. We rarely use that. So I think now's the time for the U.S. and Western countries to give Abrams tanks or Leopard tanks, other countries call them Leopards, but I call them Leopard, but to eject Russia completely out of Ukraine and establish a new line of defense against Russian aggression in this region. So that's kind of what I'm thinking right now. With winter coming, this region actually works to Ukraine's advantage. It's flat. If it freezes up, tanks can move in there easier. If it even thaws a bit, the flatness of it creates less of a problem with mud than when you're working in more hilly and forested terrain. Now there's still hills and forests here, but it's not as difficult to operate in. And yeah, that's where we're at right now. So we'll see what happens in the next 72 hours or so.